Chapter 1. To the Beginning. May the 25th, 1940, was not a date John Maclean would particularly remember, despite being close to the summit of a Norwegian mountain. The days since early April had merged into a period of intense cold and desperate survival. Tempered steel at -20 degrees Celsius is not kind to human skin. Standard kit provided no protection to his soaking, freezing body, and he couldn't remember the last time he'd felt his feet. The others were equally miserable, perhaps more so. At least he had experienced Highland winters from mountain slopes, and plenty of them. These poor buggers were lowlanders or townsfolk. Yet the men walked on, those that were still alive. John's captain was an officer fresh out of training, with all the confidence, arrogance and belief of the British Empire. The captain had been pushing his men forward since they first landed in Norway 2 months earlier. But this officer had left a trail of frozen bodies in his wake, none of whom belonged to the enemy. These had been men under his command. John guessed the captain would have been around 25 years old, only 6 years older than himself, but they were worlds apart. The small detachment was not big enough to hide the young man from Skye. As opposed to the men on either side of him, who had been tending animals, ploughing fields, working in factories, driving buses, selling shoes, John had arrived from university, his studies cut short. The captain sensed John's intelligence, was challenged by it. The officer could see how his men naturally gravitated towards the quiet soldier who seemed to know more about rifles than his own sergeant. "You, Maclean!" It was the captain marching down the line of trucks. John, who had been squatting over a paraffin fire, immediately stood to attention. "Sir." "What are you doing, Maclean?" "Heating water, sir. Making tea." John, looking straight ahead, his voice calm, measured, lacking the urgency of others when addressing the captain. "I did not give anyone permission to light up." He was looking for a fight, leaning into John's face. A range of responses were running through John's mind. He was struggling to cope with the nonsense of his officer. Should he say something? Or just punch him on the nose? John continued to look straight ahead, his mind racing, and then his peripheral vision picked out the sergeant moving towards them. "Captain, a word, please," said the sergeant. The officer pointed at John to stay still, and then moved across to the elderly sergeant so that he would be out of earshot. John knew the sergeant would be explaining that he had ordered John to get a fire going while the other lads refueled the trucks. The captain's lips sharpened. He turned to march back up the convoy, while the sergeant made his way across to John. "Carry on, Maclean," said the veteran, his voice a lesson in tested tolerance. There was a battle coming. John could see it in the captain's eyes. He could hear it in his tone of voice. The entitled, privileged man-child was going to get John and the rest of the platoon killed before they went much further. The men had not been given additional kit. They wore khaki brown, which made them stick out like flies on icing. There was no waterproofing, no protection. Trucks were canvas-covered, and weapons often failed, with parts jamming or just breaking off due to the intense cold. As for army communications, they had failed before a single foot made shore, saltwater spray only being expected by the Navy. Worst of all was the deep cold of night. Young, inexperienced, exhausted boys had quickly become more afraid of the night than the enemy. Over the first few nights, the captain and sergeant had slept in the cabin of the first truck, while most of the men were left to cope as best they could in canvas-covered trailers, cold but out of the wind and away from the frozen ground. It wasn't long, however, before the diesel froze and the trucks had to be abandoned. The men were ordered to take as many rations and as much ammunition as they could carry and set off on foot. This was when soldiers started to surrender to the cold. Over the following days, darkness would arrive all too quickly. Tired bodies won battles over fearful minds and eyes closed. Each morning revealed the men who had succumbed overnight. Sleeping young men became innocent, frozen corpses. So many wasted lives. Yet the captain pushed on, leaving the dead where they lay, the ground too hard to dig graves. John promised himself that he would grieve for them one day, that their names would never be forgotten. But he did forget. He had to. As the sergeant noted their names and locations in his little book, John caught his eye more than once. If only their mothers knew. John left behind these heaps of frozen cloth with angels' faces. He needed to keep going. There had been hints to the lads during training that John could be useful. He was a dead shot with a rifle, and looked the same at the end of route marches as most of them did at the beginning. He wasn't the biggest man in the platoon, but the young Highlander carried himself with the quiet confidence of those who are either foolish or skilled, and no one took John for a fool. So there was no resistance among those still alive when John started to teach them how to survive, how to dig holes in the snow, how to place branches and composted leaves on the floor, to huddle together and rotate sleeping positions so that no one stayed on the outside of the group for the whole night. John's actions did not please the captain, who felt his authority was being usurped, but the sergeant, a survivor of World War I trenches, stayed firmly between them. On the morning of the 25th of May 1940, the remnant of John's group walked along a ridge above the road connecting Heilonde and Uplo. They had been out of contact with their main unit for over 2 weeks and had not encountered the enemy since April. In fact, they had not directly encountered the enemy since arriving in Norway. Much to their leader's frustration, more than half his men were dead, without a single one of them firing a shot. The fighting had all been carried out by forward units. John's squad always seemed to arrive as the last fires were being put out. Lots of dead people, but no one killed by his squad. That was fine by John. However, things were about to change. A deafening, icy blast of wind cut across them, and yet John could sense that something was about to happen. On reaching a high point, he could see the line of soldiers from his unit stretching out in front of him. Suddenly, the lead man ducked away to one side. The sergeant immediately went down on one knee, holding up his right fist. The men behind threw themselves on the ground. Distant rumbling could be heard from beyond a corner in the road below the ridge. The sergeant crept back through the line. "Menzies, MacIver and MacLeod, get up with the captain. Take the bren and all the straps of ammo. The rest of you, spread yourselves along that line," the sergeant, pointing to a rim of trees connected by a knee-high bank just below their path. Getting into position behind a bank of moss and rotting branches, John could hear the increasing clatter from hidden vehicles. Then the first of them came into view at the bend, a German swastika clear on its side. "Wait for it, lads. No one is to fire a shot without my say-so." The sergeant was trying to own it, but he was looking across at the captain, waiting for a signal. "Make sure you have ammo at the ready. Safety catches off. Easy, lads. Make every shot count." The sergeant was speaking from memory. This would be his first engagement in over 20 years, his phrases coming out like lines from a well-worn poem. Coming further into view, the convoy was made up of 3 German half-track troop carriers. The vehicles were armoured, with rubber-tired wheels at the front for steering, while the main body rested above 10 feet of armoured caterpillar track, ideal for tracking through freezing, snow-covered Norwegian roads. Pointing his rifle at the leading vehicle, John was incredulous at what was about to happen. "They're armoured," he thought. "This is madness." But he knew the captain would not back away. This would be his first engagement. He needed to prove his worth. The front troop carrier came directly beneath John's position. The captain signalled, and the sergeant shouted, "Right, lads! Fire!" John, along with the others, did as he was ordered, but he could see it was pointless. Bullets bounced off doors and bodywork. They were having as much impact as moths on lantern glass. The sergeant, too, knew that this was not a sensible course of action. "Keep at it, lads. Keep them guessing. I'm going to have a quick word with the skipper. Don't let them get out of those trucks." The first carrier turned to face the slope, while the other two closed the gaps between them. A rear door flew open with Wehrmacht troops emerging like angry wasps from an invaded nest, only the tops of their helmets visible to John's squad. Using cover from the other two carriers, German soldiers quickly set up mortar positions, and within seconds the first shell landed by a tree some 10 feet ahead of the captain's position. There was a short delay before a second mortar round was sent up. This time, the explosion was on point, and it was deafening. Bullets started to fly above John's head, and then the sergeant's arm, complete with torn khaki and chevroned insignia badge, landed on the snow just in front of him. No blood. No time for blood. "Christ, they've got the Sarge!" yelled James. Where did it all begin? How had John's life become so easy to cast away? How had it come to this? Those questions are all but impossible to answer fully. Too much water has flowed under the bridge, too many generations carried in its currents. Staying with the tip of the iceberg, let's say it started here, on a summer's day in 1920. Branches of the Finlayson and Maclean families, both of whom lived around the shores of Little Loch Broom, attended the wedding of Rebecca Finlayson to Murdo Maclean. Rebecca was a fiercely independent woman who, through an accident of fate and her father's role as head gamekeeper of the Dundonald estate, had received an expensive education. Rebecca's mother died from cancer while the children were very young. Hugh Mackenzie, who owned the estate, had taken pity on his widowed gamekeeper and ensured the children were taught alongside his own by the resident governess. Rebecca went on to gain a teaching degree from Edinburgh University. She returned to her homeland as the most qualified teacher for 100 miles in any direction. Somewhere along the line, she identified her purpose too. Rebecca would establish schools throughout the Highlands so that children from every background could be armed with the tools to escape servitude, poverty, and hopelessness. Perhaps Rebecca married Murdo because she loved him, or maybe, since the Great War had taken so many, it was because he was still alive. But possibly it was because of his flexibility. Murdo could turn his hand to anything. Over the next 40 years, Murdo would follow his wife around the Highlands and Islands as she founded schools. Rebecca would gather the children, recruit teachers, organise curriculums, and drive standards. Murdo organised and worked with local labourers to build the schools. With backdrops of open fields, woods, rivers and mountains, playgrounds were simply not required. Thomas John Maclean was born to Rebecca and Murdo on the 11th of January 1921, their firstborn. A winter baby, inheriting the history of two proud clans, but also the determination, intelligence, resourcefulness, humour and loving nature of a pioneering mother and a devoted father. Ahead of the baby's arrival, Rebecca had moved into her father's hotel, which he had gained through marriage to his second wife. Murdo became hotelier, policeman and postman in the small village of Dundonald. The family would stay there for the next 2 years. Thomas John, as had been the way since time immemorial, was named after his 2 grandfathers, Thomas Maclean and John Finlayson. But Rebecca insisted on calling him John, and of course that meant his father and 2 sisters had to do so too. John never went by the name Thomas. It wasn't that he disliked his other grandfather, it was more that he hardly ever saw him. John Finlayson, on the other hand, was the man who brought him up even more than his own father. Hardly a weekend went by where the young John didn't trek the hills and mountains with Grandpa John. As John grew, he was taught Gaelic, Greek, Latin, English and science. And when released from his desk, his grandfather would show him how to hunt, shoot, fish, trap and survive among the distant winter mountains, and how to tend sheep and cattle on the fields near the castle. John spoke Gaelic whenever he was away from the classroom, but his mother was insistent that all classes should be held in English. Where John had to translate Latin and Greek, it was always into English. Many of the parents of other children were unhappy with this measure, feeling that their culture was being eroded. Rebecca, however, was determined that children from the Highlands of Scotland should be able to go out into the world and have professions. This would not happen using a language that no one else could speak or understand. It is strange, then, to think that before his 20th birthday, John's skill in Gaelic would stop a whole country entering the war on Germany's side. But we will come to that. The Finlaysons tended to be well educated, but the Macleans were of rougher stock. Crofters, fishermen and often journeyman soldiers. The matriarchy that was Rebecca and Murdo's home ensured that John was raised to be a quiet man. He loved hearing the Gaelic stories recited around the hearth by Grandpa John. He knew the songs of battles lost and love won as if they were ingrained within him. He knew the dances of stags in the hills, and on Sundays he knew the Psalms of David and the precentor's voice. He knew the stories of Ivanhoe, Moby Dick and Robinson Crusoe, and he knew the strategies of battle commanders. Not just the British, but the Greeks, Romans, French, American and Germans too. Across the Highlands of the 1920s and 1930s, there were raised men and women who defied caricature, who would stand in the gaps left by the fallen of the Great War. Through the efforts of Rebecca, supported by Murdo and a handful of others similarly driven, generations of Highland men and women might not be forced into uniform and lost in futile sacrifice, or forced to live in cold, draught-prone hovels, harvesting seaweed and gutting fish. Instead, they could now go forth to make the world a better place. Highlanders do not all come from one source. They are a mix of Vikings, Celts, Druids, Picts, and even Romans. The Finlaysons are of Viking stock, while the Macleans are Celts. But they all share a great love of music, poetry, dance and magic. And none of this was lost on John. Throughout his life, even towards the end when almost unconscious with alcohol, he would sing old Gaelic songs with a voice that could charm birds from the trees, and would not leave a dry eye in the room. In 1934, Rebecca moved her family to Glen Hinnistall on the Isle of Skye. There had been a schoolhouse in the glen since 1880, but it had fallen into disrepair. The nearest school was in Portree, the island's capital, and children either stayed there for weeks at a time or left school early to work on their family crofts or fishing boats. Rebecca would change all that. And as her own children were getting closer to finishing their education, the stay in this meandering glen needed to be much longer than previous teaching engagements. Living on Skye made it more difficult for the young John to get over to see his favourite grandfather. Previously, he could walk, or if no mountain climbing was involved, he could take a pony. On the island of Skye, however, a ferry crossing was required which cost money and was not always reliable. He could walk over a day to Kyleakin, only to find that the ferry was cancelled for bad weather. He wrote letters to his Grandpa John at that time, which spoke to his yearning for the mountains. And while there were plenty of mountains on Skye, what he really missed was his grandfather. But the move to Glen Hinnestall brought John closer to his father. The absence of Grandpa John forced the boy to let Murdo in.